If the linchpin of Wasteland thesis is that the international rules-based order is deteriorating, in the last few days we've seen Trump call Zelensky a dictator, Rubio talk about a Russian-US alliance, European defense stocks rally over US insecurity, Turkey cozy up alongside Ukraine, Taiwan looks more and more ripe for the taking. Just how badly is this proceeding?
Well, there's an old saying that's been ascribed to Lenin, but Lenin never actually said it. That which is that years go by and nothing happens. And then days and weeks go by and decades happen. And we're in one of those periods right now. Keep in mind that the post-war world lasted for 80 years. That's a very long time in history, especially given all the technological and economic and social changes. So to have a military alliance last for 80 years during any period of history, but particularly this period, which has been so tumultuous with change, is extraordinary. And the one thing history teaches is that nothing lasts forever. Everything ultimately evolves. Essentially, we're entering into a world that's more unstable because allies help you project power. They also protect you, and they also give you advice. Allies of 8 decades give you advice. They'll tell you what you don't want to hear because they have a very close and therefore easy relationship with you. Once you start throwing away allies, you're really alone in the world. It's great when the wind is at your back, but when the wind is in your face, which ultimately happens, you don't have allies. It's very bad. So I think this is it's a very tumultuous period. I obviously finished Wasteland months and months ago, the way the books work in production. And when I finished it, I had no idea whatsoever that Trump would win. It was just too close to call. There were just too many. This was even long before Biden had dropped out, kind of. But I think though circumstances are changing radically, this bears out the message of the book.
And generally, the theme is in your answer there as well that given the rule-based order of diplomacy, economic integration, international standards, it's transitioning to this more regional, hard power, military force, narrower thinking, transactional alliances. You also mentioned there, it's great when the wind is at your back that you can say fuck you to your allies, but when it's not, you need to rely on your allies. This is the whole point of a trade-off in a relationship. Not everything's going to be all good all the time. But what are the implications of this transition, which you've written about in Wasteland and are describing now?
Well, the implications are, remember, we're in a world that's more anxious, more claustrophobic, more tightly connected than ever before because of technology. Technology has shrunk geography, and that makes it all closer, but not necessarily safer. The fact that that an event or a geopolitical crisis in the Middle East can affect a social campus crisis in the United States to a degree never before, that's new. Attrition of the same adds up to big change. And therefore, this tightening of the world due to technology often goes unnoticed because it's so gradual, essentially. So when we have a world that's, moving into the direction, as you said, and which I agree with, of military-oriented regional alliances, it makes things even more dangerous. Because we have Russia, North Korea, China united against Ukraine, Israel. I mean, everything is connected. Everything is connected, and connections are great in the financial world. I mean, interconnectivity has created global markets, extreme wealth, all of that. But in the geopolitical world, it's a negative.
Yeah, you'd rather have many, many linchpins rather than one or two key ones that connect the entire globe. Is it primarily disruptions to global supply chains that small conflicts now have global implications, or are there more important factors as well?
Well, I would put it this way. In the business and financial world, it's like a cliche to say that we have to take into account geopolitics, But the fact is that that the financial markets have priced in rather impressively 25 years of war in the Middle East, 3 years of war in Ukraine. Nobody can look at their retirement statements and see a big change because of a war in Ukraine or a war between Israel and Gaza. But there's a but here. The one area of the world that could cause, really almost an extinction level event in financial markets would be a war in the Western Pacific between the United States and China, the world's two largest economies, engaged in a high-end conflict over the South China Sea or Taiwan, and right in the middle of the world's most busiest commercial shipping lanes, which automatically disrupt supply chains in a way that supply chains have not even been disrupted in Ukraine, and certainly not between Israel and Gaza.
It sounds like as well, because of the raw efficiency that globalization has allowed, that I can be consuming a microphone here that has products from 14 different places in each corner of the world. There is no sort of elasticity in when force is applied to it. It just breaks. It doesn't.
You've cut to the chase. There's no elasticity. We live it. Globalization is fantastic, but it's also very fragile. It's amazing how fragile our world is. Imagine if we had financial markets taken down for a week in 2 or 3 large cities in the world. Or if we had an electric power blackout that would not allow internet use for like a week, on the East Coast or something like that, what that would do to markets and everything. So we live in our good luck, our good fortune to be alive at a time when most of us have no physical threats or financial threats is based on a very fragile equilibrium of sorts that can be disrupted by war and conflict.
Robert, just a quick change of tack. In one of your books, you contrast tragic wisdom versus utopian thinking to characterize 2 different types of leaders. Do you think that they're both contagious? So, for instance, if leaders at any given time understand that history is full of unintended consequences, that power is inherently corrupting, that even the best intentions can lead them to disaster, then they set that model for everyone else around them and keep those utopian thinkers at bay. But since Trump is a classic utopian, his success, influence, and power is as well contagious, creating room for many other utopian thinkers that now copy the playbook.
Donald Trump has, to put it mildly, no sense of the tragic. And if you think about it, all of our impressive presidents throughout American history, I'm not just talking about Roosevelt and Lincoln. Roosevelt was the ultimate realist with a sense of the tragic. He gave billions of dollars of weapons to Stalin, who is a mass murderer, so that Stalin could fight a war with the other mass murderer, Hitler. I mean, that's how much of a realist Roosevelt was. Lend-Lease was not just with Great Britain, it was with Soviet Russia. People often forget that. So it's not just Roosevelt and Lincoln, but George H.W. Bush, who is always thinking naturally, tragically. Kennedy, who is a real worrier. The more I read about him, the more impressed I am, and the more convinced I am that his assassination was a terrible tragedy, because had he lived, we would not have gotten involved in the Vietnam War to the degree that we did. Trump has no sense of the tragic because he's ultimately not a serious person. And that is somewhat new in American politics. I mean, Nixon may have done wrong, but he had a conscience. He sweated when he lied. Serious, not to make fun of him, but Nixon understood shame. And when Nixon retired, he never got on the speaking circuit, never tried to make a lot of money, just wrote serious books the rest of his life. Carter was very serious. George W. Bush, who perpetrated the Iraq War, has known shame, and just he paints portraits of soldiers, in his retirement, and that's a way of dealing, I think, in an inarticulate way with the shame that he's experienced. But Trump knows nothing like this. Trump, I would go further. I want to be careful with the word I use here. He's post-literate, not illiterate. Post-literate means he doesn't read narrative history. He knows nothing about the history of the NATO alliance, or World War II or anything. He lives in a world of smartphones and social media. And frankly, he may not be the last president like that, given the way that the technology has changed media. But, people call Trump a fascist. He's not serious enough to be a fascist. I mean, he doesn't have a worked out program to be a fascist. He's unique. He's a world historical figure, not because he understands the world and history, but because his very impulses are changing the direction of history.
But to the central point of the question, Robert, the contagion. Have you just noticed in the cycles of history that tragic thinkers are contagious to their contemporaries, and now utopian thinkers, with Trump as the absolute model of them, is contagious? If you look around the world, there's a couple of utopian guys that are getting very, very popular.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought of that. That's a very good point. I would put it that each category of thinkers encourages the same category in other world leaders. I would say. We've had how to win. Yeah, like Reagan got along great with Thatcher. And that made world history, in a sense. Reagan got along great with Pope John Paul II. But Trump gets along with Putin. And Putin is a reader. He's not like Trump. He's a much deeper, more serious person than Trump. I hate to use the word evil because it's so overused. It becomes a lazy journalist term, so to speak. But the Wall Street Journal news section ran a front page long researched article about 10 days ago about all the methods of torture that that the Russians have perfected to use against Ukrainian prisoners. And you got a chilling sense reading that article of real pure evil. There's nothing accidental or emotional or overheated about what they were doing to Ukrainian prisoners. It was all very methodical and thought out and approved at the highest levels.
And informed by their experiences elsewhere.
Yeah.
In Revenge of Geography, you write about the geography's role in shaping nation and politics. Before I ask you that question, what do you make of Tim Marshall's work?
I'm actually not that familiar with it. It's the thing is, after I finished I'm ashamed to say, after I finished the Revenge of Geography, I moved on, and I had to read a lot of other books for other subjects. I'm aware of him. I'm aware that he sells very well, but I'm not familiar enough to have an opinion.
No problem. This is the point of me bringing up Revenge of Geography. The question being that you've said geography is destiny, but what if in the modern era, invisible infrastructures such as semiconductors, data flows, technological edge are in fact geographical checkpoints? Think about TSMC in Taiwan, subsea internet cables, a Russian gas pipeline into Germany. If this is true, then future wars might not necessarily be fought over land. They'll be fought over who controls the networks that make civilization function. Would you agree with this, or do you still see physical geography as a bigger force?
I see the point you're making is becoming stronger and stronger as we go on, but it's a long process. And it's like oil. We're still in the oil age. You know, we may have wind and solar and all of that, but for a time being, we'll still be in the oil and gas age. And it's the same with geography. Geography still matters. And what encouraged me to write that book was I wasn't being a fatalist. You know, the subtitle of the book was about, you know, how to avoid the battle against fate, you know, the revenge of geography, you know, future conflicts and the battle against fate. But I wrote the book because the the intellectual journalistic world in the United States was totally taken up by ideas, that ideas were everything, and therefore they discounted physical factors. You know, because it wasn't interesting to them. It was just there, you know? And what could you do about it? So why write about it? So it's 50, so I was covering the other 50% of reality that the media was missing. And I often start off with this anecdote, which will get to the point. Taiwan is about 98 miles away from mainland China. Were it 20 miles away, the width of the English Channel, mainland China would have conquered Taiwan back in the late 1940s and early 1950s. There wouldn't be a Taiwan today. It would just be a province of China. So geography matters. I mean, why did we dig the Panama Canal? You know, why did the French dig the Suez Canal? If geography didn't matter, none of these things would have happened.
Yeah. Or another Taiwan example, which just I'm preparing for an interview with Kerry Brown, the sinologist, and I was
Yes.
listening to an interview with Morris Chang, the CEO of TSMC, for that, and he made this comment that for their facilities, Taiwan has this abundance of very, very fresh water at the back of their facility, which isn't unique across the world, obviously, but it is one small geographical reason why this company does thrive so well here and potentially couldn't elsewhere. And therefore, you know, it's
Oh, and
downstream
that's
of
also
geography.
true of semiconductor. You know, that's true of Silicon Valley too. You know, it needs to be near fresh water. I mean, why is America a great country? Well, one of the reasons is not only because it's a continent with two oceans, with an ocean on each side of it, but because it has an internal navigable river system larger than most of the rest of the world combined, which facilitated commerce and the development of the nation in the 19th century.
Furthermore, one more point on sort of the interplay between technology and geography. Do you see that technology might mitigate a country's geographical defenses? Think of thousands of drones, faster planes, higher planes, missiles that take less than a minute to travel 100 kilometers. How much do these geographical blessings no longer actually count for much?
Well, they start to count for less and less. Still, planes have to pass mountain ranges. And you know, when I'm asked to define Russia, I say it's the classic insecure land power. It covers 11 time zones, but no natural borders with Europe. So unless it's on the move in an aggressive way, it feels itself under threat. You know, there's a reason why democracy and liberal governments in general have tended to come from Venice, from England, from the United States, because they're all sea powers. You know, and sea powers are all about cosmopolitanism from ports. And sea powers are protected by water, so they feel safer and they're able to take more chances with their domestic politics.
Can you give more examples about what you've researched and how drones might be a significant part of warfare going forward?
Yeah, well, we're moving out of the era of heroic war in some senses. I think the last fighter jet pilot has already been born, you know?
Right.
So that, we may still have aircraft carriers, but because they're moving bases at sea, essentially, that are sovereign. But they may in the future only carry drones. When we think of drones, we think of small model planes and maybe a little bigger. But you can have drones the size of fighter jets in the future, and with the same power. So that I think drones may lead to smaller armed forces in terms of manpower. And again, it will take the heroism out of war. But still, I can tell you, I once researched a story for the Atlantic on drone pilots at a base in Nevada, and they suffered from real anxiety because they were killing people in Iraq and Afghanistan from half a world away, and then they just get up from their desk and be in Las Vegas, essentially. It sounds funny, but it's not. They have nobody to talk to, they're totally disoriented, and they've just sat down at a chair and killed people.
Yeah,
So,
it's crazy.
drones are very interesting, and in ways that people often don't think about.
And it sort of compounds into the opening points that we were making, which is the fragility of having such a tightly efficient global economic supply chain. Because, for instance, were there to be a war, these are extremely complicated products that come from 10s, 20, 30 different countries. So maybe like a leading indicator of some type of aggression could be the hoarding of these certain types of materials.
Yeah, and drones also make the war military budgets smaller. They save money because much of what's in a fighter jet or a bomber is money spent on protecting the human being flying it. Once you don't need to protect any individual flying it, you can produce the thing at much lesser cost.
All right, Robert, I got a few more for you. I think we're going to run on time. You've been thinking about the interplay of cultures and nations for 40 years, probably longer, but that's at least how long you've been writing about it. And that's taken you all over the world. Supposedly, Bill Clinton was reading your book on the Balkans while he was involved in the Yugoslav wars. Do you see your work more as a service to the historical record when people look back 100 years from now, or something to influence those in power today and force policy?
Well, I'm always nervous when it influences policy because it can influence, because a reader can take a different lesson from your book than you intended. Once you do a book, people will interpret it any way they want. I think when I look back at my earlier books, what I see is the best thing that I can do is that I painted a picture of reality as it existed at that particular moment in history. Like when I'm writing about soldiers in Iraq and Imperial Grunts or something like that, or American soldiers, special forces training in Colombia in 2003, or in the Philippines or something. That's the way it was at that time. It may have been very different a year or two later, but that if you want a gritty feel for what it was like, in the field at that particular moment, the book is useful, and that's I think the best that I can do.
Have there been any instances that you know of where you have influenced policy?
Yes, I supported the Iraq War, which I came to regret. And I think Clinton took the wrong lessons from Balkan Ghosts. So I'm a fair, those kinds of things really chasten.
This is as well totally tangential, Robert, but where does Australia ever enter into your worldview?
Yes, it does. I've written about Australia because I've written several books about the Pacific. Asia's Cauldron, published in 2014, And Monsoon, published in 2010, Monsoon was about the Indian Ocean, the greater Indian Ocean, and Asia's Cauldron was about the greater South China Sea. So what I noticed about Australia is that it's a vast continent, but it has very few people, and most of them are clustered in the southeast. So it makes it very hard to defend the continent. So for decades, Australia had a very good situation. It was able to get rich off the rising Chinese economy, particularly in the Perth area. And yet it was defended ultimately by the United States Navy and Air Force in the Pacific, because though Australia has a great military tradition, because of its small population, it cannot really have a strategic military, in that sense. So, but now that U.S.-China relations, not just now, for the last 8 years or so, the U.S.-China relations have gotten fairly tense, mainly because of a Leninist autocrat in power in Beijing. It's harder for Australia to enjoy both worlds, getting rich off China and being protected by America. And I think Australia has jumped to the side of America with the AUKUS deal, which, as you know, is about getting a few nuclear-powered submarines through British and American technology.
Could you ever make sense for why we don't have any deeper cultural relations, diplomatic relations, or economic relations with our closest neighbors, Indonesia? Or more with Singapore, more with the Philippines?
I think Australia for Australia, Indonesia is the closest dangerous place in a way, because it's very populous. It's been unstable at times. It has a lot of far-flung islands with a lot going on in them. So Indonesia has always been a challenge for Australia. And I've often heard that Australians sometimes get frustrated with New Zealanders because New Zealand can afford to have its more idealistic foreign policy because it's physically protected by Australia, which serves as a buffer. So there you have geography again.
Absolutely, yeah. And also part of the geography of Australia is that because the populace is so far in the southeast, were someone to attack us, they've just got this incomprehensibly large amount of land to sort of get through beforehand.
Yeah.
And our internal river system is nothing like the United States. It's actually, when you just look at the geography comparison, it's quite a good one because we're similarly sized, yet you're populous all the way throughout. And we've got, as many people as you have in Los Angeles or something like that in the entire country. What's a position that you hold that rubs up against those who believe in the status quo?
It's everyone wants things to stay the same. I mean, most people do. We're always upset by change. When someone is fired from a job, when a boss changes hands, you get very nervous who's the new boss is going to be. But, as I said earlier, history is all about change. Things are constantly changing. The status quo is always very tenuous. It can always be shaken. And I think we're living through that right now.
You're going to drive yourself nuts holding on to the sentimental past of what you wanted rather than just embracing the change, however it will go.
Yeah. And we all do that, and that operates in foreign policy as well. And you see that now, the collective elite, even mass democracies require a bureaucratic elite to run things, The collective elite is driving itself crazy, and for good reason, at some of the tumultuous changes going on in Washington.
So with that all being said, you are constantly riding the waves of change, trying to remain conscious of the fact that, you just can't settle for the status quo. Things are going to always be in flux. Things are always changing. But clearly you see Trump as a destructive, I would say altogether not good figure for the world and for the United States. Like, how do you make sense of this moment, and how pessimistic are you for the future of your own country and then, say, the next 10, 15 years for global order?
All right. Well, I'll conclude by saying that the United States has been a great, powerful mass democracy in the print and typewriter age that emerged as an empire at the end of World War II. And that lasted for 80 years of relative stability. And that age is passing now. It's not just what we spoke about earlier of, about the post-war order changing, but also the technology is changing. We're no longer in the print and typewriter age. We're in the digital video, social media era, which I think gives gives an advantage to passion, to simplistic solutions, which are all the enemies of analysis. So I'm not convinced that America will lead the world in this new era that we're just embarking upon now.
Robert, I know that you were tight on 30, but just let me finish off with this question, if you don't mind. If life is made up of a large number of small moments and a small number of large ones, what is the role that serendipity has played throughout your career and throughout your life?
Well, the person who did the most for my journalistic career died several months ago, William Whitworth, who is the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic for 20 years. And before that, he was deputy editor of The New Yorker. And I submitted a few pieces to him on speculation back in the 1980s, and the long and the short of it was he brought me to The Atlantic, where I wrote for decades. And it wasn't completely serendipity, but he was a sympathetic editor, is the way I would put it.
Robert, thank you so much for being so generous this morning.
All right, well, thank you so much. That was a really super intelligent interview, so I really enjoyed it.
Oh, it's nice of you to say. Thank you, Robert. Have a good one.